Hello, everyone. This is Eli Cohn-Postel. I'm the Director of Israel Engagement at the JCRC of Greater Boston. Welcome and thank you for joining this Israel briefing being recorded on the morning of July 26th, 2021. Today we'll be covering some updates on the new Israeli government and how things are going about 6 weeks or so after their swearing in and the establishment of the new government and the new governing coalition in Israel. So if you'll remember the big questions that we were kind of left with last time, the last update we did was right around when the government was formed. And the big questions that we were left with will this government be stable? And will they be able to do really much of anything at all? So you might remember that the current coalition has the minimum required 61 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. So that, it's a very narrow coalition in terms of the raw numbers. So any sort of defections or any people who don't vote in line with the coalition will be, that means that laws don't get passed. It means relative inaction for the government and for the governing majority, and a kind of paralysis on their part if they're not able to sort of keep all 61 coalition members in line with their stated policies. And also, it's an incredibly ideologically diverse coalition. So you'll remember we have Naftali Bennett as the prime minister, representing a right-wing party, the Yamina party, the right party. We have Yair Lapid, who's the alternative prime minister, the foreign minister, and negotiated the coalition as sort of a more centrist Yesh Atid party. And we have all the way, left Zionist, primarily Zionist Jewish parties in the Labor Party and the Meretz Party. And for the first time in Israel's history, we have an Arab party as part of the coalition, the conservative Islamist Ram Party. So not only do we have only 61 out of 120 seats in the coalition, so they have to maintain unity in order to pass legislation. We also have a situation where, because of the ideological diversity of the group, it's very difficult for them to agree on anything or to agree on many things. So they can really only pass laws and move forward on legislation where there's a great consensus within the coalition. We'll also be reminded that former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it's still a reflex there to call him the Prime Minister, even though he is not. But former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu still leads the Likud party, is a member of the Knesset, and leads the opposition. And that'll be a part of the story as we get on a little bit later. But it's important to remember that he's still very much a part of the conversation here and in Israeli politics. So I'd like to start with the question of, will the government be able to do anything? And sort of what we've learned after 6 weeks, about this particular coalition. Will they be able to do anything? The answer is yes, but it's relatively difficult for the reasons I mentioned before. There are not a lot of areas where they have consensus about policy amongst the different parties that make up this coalition. But there have been some changes. Some of the big picture things are a little bit more obvious or expected. So Israel, like the rest of the world, is still very much managing the COVID pandemic. The borders of the country have been opening somewhat. There have been some tour groups and others that have been allowed in. But they, like others, are also very concerned about the Delta variant, which is causing a rising number of infections in Israel, which is all to say that the idea of managing COVID, of changing the restrictions at the airport, of figuring out when and how schools are going to reopen, are all responsibilities of this new governing coalition that they've taken on and are figuring out how they can build consensus in their positions, both amongst the governing cabinet and amongst the smaller COVID cabinet. But another change that's happened since the governing coalition took place, since the new government took place, is that they've announced changes to school subsidies for ultra-Orthodox families and changes to the welfare structure for ultra-Orthodox families. So another thing that you might remember about this governing coalition that's not unique but is notable is that it does not include any of the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel. So all of the ultra-Orthodox parties sit in the opposition. There are a couple of parties in the governing coalition, including Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party and also Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party, or Israel is Our Home party, that are staunchly secular, and in some of their legislative priorities really quite anti-ultra-Orthodox, or just interested in changing the status quo in Israel as it relates to the ultra-Orthodox, and in particular into sort of the social burdens social and economic burdens to the rest of society that they're viewed as by these parties at times. So, for example, there are subsidies that are paid to ultra orthodox families for study and to send their kids to school, things like that. They're trying to change those, or they are changing those subsidies. They've announced changing those subsidies in order to encourage more Ashkenazi men, adult men, to enter the workforce. So where a lot of ultra-Orthodox men are currently receiving subsidies to continue studying yeshiva, continue studying Jewish text, this will eliminate some of those subsidies in an effort to encourage ultra-Orthodox men to enter the workforce. So that's one thing that's being changed, because there's some agreement about that within the coalition, within multiple parties of the coalition. And in part because that can happen partly because it happens specifically within the finance ministry and doesn't necessarily need a vote or something like that necessarily. But that being said, those are, managing COVID is a relatively big thing that any government would have had to do. Changes to subsidies for ultra-Orthodox families is a relatively small thing. We'll see if we get into some of the bigger topics like the ultra-Orthodox being drafted into the Israeli army at a later time with this coalition. But there are also some things that have not gone well, and some things that the coalition thought they had consensus about that they didn't, or thought they may be able to get some members of the opposition to vote with them on certain things, and they didn't. So a few examples of that. One is there's been an effort and sort of a conversation in Israel for many years now, in a few election cycles, about decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana. And there was an effort by the coalition to pass legislation that would decriminalize marijuana in Israel. And that was defeated because the Ram party, which is a part of the coalition, does not support that. And here's a case where, I think people's assumptions about what it means to have an Arab party in the coalition are tested, because a lot of people, I think, assumed that having an Arab party in the coalition would support the left, the idea of the political left in Israel, the idea of, Arab inclusion, the idea of building a shared society in Israel, between a more equitable society in Israel between Jews and Arabs, is more frequently a political talking point of the left than of the right. So I think there was a thought in Israel that including an Arab party in the coalition would support the political left. But what you have is two Arab parties sit in Knesset right now, and one is the Ram party and one is the Joint Arab List. And the Ram party is a conservative party, and the Joint Arab List is a more liberal party. But the Ram party is the one that's in the coalition, and they are a religious fundamentalist party in a lot of ways, and an Islamist party. And so when it comes to topics like drug legalization, they are anti-drug legalization. And so you have a situation where, people assume, I think, that having an Arab party as part of the coalition will support what's seen as a more liberal position, like the legalization or decriminalization of marijuana, but actually ends up resulting in the more conservative position, which is, the Israeli government's inability to pass that legislation despite support from other places in the coalition. A second example are changes to local rabbinic courts. So this is something that was proposed. The the governing coalition, has its first Reform rabbi in it. So there's a Reform rabbi who's a member of the Labor Party, who's a member of Knesset, and is a part of the governing coalition, and proposed legislation to change the local rabbinic authorities, not just rabbinic authorities, but the local religious authorities. So you remember that there's no sort of civic religion in Israel, that matters of marriage, divorce, and other life cycle events are run through religious authorities. So that's a rabbinic court for the Jewish community and a Sharia court for the Muslim community, and different facilities for the Christian and other communities. That's a leftover from the Ottoman system, from when the Ottomans were in charge of this area. And so there was an effort to change those courts to make them more representative, more inclusive, I believe include more women, possibly implement term limits to the local rabbinic courts, and it was proposed by the first Reform rabbi, who's a member of Knesset. And what happened in this case was someone voted wrong. The Speaker of Knesset actually voted no instead of voting yes in the final reading of the bill, and the final vote was a tie, and that meant that the legislation failed in its final reading. So a bill that has to go through 3 readings of the Knesset and 3 votes in order to become law. So they could, in theory, start again, but it's a long process. So it's just another example of, because there are only, they can't lose any votes with a 61 seat majority. If someone votes the wrong way, a 61 to 59 majority, if someone votes the wrong way, suddenly legislation isn't passing, even if it's, and sometimes people do that on purpose, and sometimes people do it because it's an accident in this case, but it's irrelevant. It means that, it's just very difficult for the governing coalition to do its work, even in areas where they can drill out a consensus. And then the final thing that is interesting to highlight, again, because it's going to bleed into that second question a little bit of, will this government be a stable government? But this final issue is the issue of family unification. So there's a law in Israel that was passed during the Second Intifada about 15 or 20 years ago now, that did not grant automatic citizenship to Palestinians who marry Israeli citizens. So, for example, if you are a Palestinian who is a citizen of Israel, who lives in the city of Ramla, for example, outside of Tel Aviv, and you marry a Palestinian from the West Bank who's not a citizen of Israel, it is not a guarantee that your partner, your spouse, will be granted Israeli citizenship. And that's what the law has been in Israel for about 15 or 20 years now. And this law, it's a 1-year law that is renewed every year. So they passed it initially for a year, and every year since then they've renewed it. And the current coalition went up to renew this law, and they couldn't get the votes. They couldn't get the votes for a couple of reasons. One is because the Arab Ram party and some of the left-wing, primarily Jewish Zionist parties don't agree. They don't agree with the law in principle. They were willing to make changes to the law to maintain coalition harmony. So they wanted some amendments to the law to maintain coalition harmony. And the amendments that they wanted caused one other member of the coalition from the right to not support the law anymore. And so, depending on your perspective, it's a good news, bad news situation. The law didn't pass. The opposition was able to defeat the law because of the amendments and because one person who was a part of the coalition wouldn't vote for it. So again, you're seeing the issues with the ideological diversity and with the razor-thin majority in the Knesset and how those play out in practice. So the change is that now, in theory, Palestinians or anyone who's an Israeli citizen who's married to a Palestinian should be able to apply, their spouse and their family members should be able to apply for Israeli citizenship now. But what this illustrates is how, one other thing that's related to stability, which is how focused both the coalition and the opposition are on their priorities and on their positions, and how their positions will change based on whether they're in the governing coalition or whether they're in the opposition. Because family reunification, again, we have a new government, and the opposition that's now Likud and Benjamin Netanyahu, we're just the government. They have been the ones who have been passing who've been repacifying and recertifying the family reunification law every year. For years and years and years, they've been the ones, and they've been the government who have been passing this law. But now they're in the opposition, they're voting against the law, okay? They're voting against something that they voted for years and years and years. Why? Because it embarrasses the coalition. Because if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, your case is that these people who are in the governing coalition can't do it as well as I can. I'm a better prime minister than they are. I do better at keeping Israel safe than they do. And look, they just failed to pass this law that was an Israeli security measure. They're so disorganized and such a mess of a group of people that they can't even pass basic legislation that we need to keep this country safe. If I was the prime minister, I would be able to pass this legislation. So depending on where you sit in the governing coalition or in the opposition, your vote will change. And we mentioned those other parties too, the Ram Party, the Labour Party, the Meretz Party. These are parties that in the opposition would also be voting against a law like this. They were willing to negotiate about it because they sit in the coalition. But their votes and their position changes based on where they sit, based on whether you're in. It's not necessarily about, this is the thing that I believe and this is my core thing, and no matter what happens, I'll never vote against this thing. I think it shows that everything in politics and everything in Israeli politics is at least a little bit flexible depending on where you're sitting during the current government. But that has to do with the second question also of, will the government be stable? Because the answer is so far yes. People have shown that flexibility. They've had a lot of trouble managing the opposition. Benjamin Netanyahu is, able, as we saw from the last example about unification, is able to exploit very narrow cracks within the coalition, within the government, in order to make the opposition look stronger. And at the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu and a strong opposition is the thing that has united these parties that are actually in the coalition from the beginning. Many of them would not otherwise be sitting together in a coalition were it not for their opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu being at the head of the government. So that, as frustrating as it is for them in their attempts to govern and to govern smoothly, that they have a very difficult opposition, it does also in some sense serve as a uniting factor for the coalition, and as a glue element that holds them together. Their desire to keep Benjamin Netanyahu in the opposition and to keep him from returning to the prime minister's seat. So far they have been stable. They've shown that flexibility. They are due to pass a budget this fall, and they need to pass a budget in order for the coalition to stay together. So, absent a budget, the government will fall and they'll go to another election. So that's obviously a much bigger test than what we've seen so far for such a diverse group to come to, an agreement on the principles and priorities of their budget. But we'll see what happens with that in the fall. So these are all stories we'll be keeping an eye on. If anything else comes up, we'll do another briefing, and thank you again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.